There is a new foreign policy in Washington. This policy calls itself America First, but to me, it seems an awful lot like it's China first, Russia second, and America last. We have spent the past 3 weeks lying for Russia, carrying water for them, and burning up our alliances in pursuit of a peace that will not last because the peace we seek is not genuine or just. Neville Chamberlain wasn't a fool, but he was wrong about Hitler. He gambled on peace and lost. His mistake wasn't appeasement itself, it was trusting that Hitler would stop after getting what he wanted. But Chamberlain and Hitler met face to face at the start of his conquest. Trump and Putin will meet 11 years into Putin's. Since 2014, Putin has violated 25 ceasefires and 4 treaties during his invasion of Ukraine. Putin cannot be trusted, and he will continue his piecemeal aggression just like Hitler and Saddam before him. But still, we are negotiating with him about Ukraine without Ukraine, and in these negotiations we are offering 2 concessions: removing troops from all of Europe and leaving NATO. The president is letting an arsonist rewrite the city's fire code. This would effectively end NATO, the 80-year Transatlantic Alliance as we know it, and American hegemony, and when Trump is eventually gone, we will not be able to get it back. I think it's important to tell you what everyone in Brussels and Washington already knows. America is not retreating under the pressure of the Cold War. It's switching teams from team democracy to team autocracy. Don't take my word for it, take the Kremlin's word for it, who said, quote, "Trump's foreign policy configurations largely benefit us." This shift is not because the hearts of the American people have come to hate freedom, but rather our country has been hijacked by a small group of selfish men who have clipped the wings of the American eagle to feather their own nests. So I come to you today to present the case for American hegemony and the Transatlantic Alliance, because without NATO and our European allies, America is not the global hegemon. China is. To start, let's talk about how alliances work and why the US, the most powerful country on Earth, has spent the past 80 years building them. So why would a country even want an alliance? So it all comes down to this idea of collective security. Think of it like this. Recently, there's been an arsonist squatter going around the city. He's huge. He's like 700 pounds and 12 feet tall, and maybe he's got a big stone club. He's banging on my door and he's saying, "You're going to let me take your house or I'm going to burn it down." By myself, I don't really stand a chance against this thing. No amount of Home Alone tactics is going to result in my victory. But here's the thing, once he's done with me, he's going straight next door, so maybe I can't beat this giant arsonist squatter, but if the whole block groups its resources together, we could beat him. Forming this alliance as the threat arrives at my door, though, has ensured that the only 2 options are fight or surrender. Now, in a timeline where we know about collective security, this is how it would work. We would hear about this freak and we would form a defensive alliance amongst our block, but then we would also create an alliance with all the other blocks in the city. Now, instead of fighting the city's residents one by one and just destroying the place, the minute he attacks one of us, he attacks all of us. So ultimately, he chooses to skip over our city and attacks a different one instead. The whole point of collective security is to avoid war, and in this case, it was very successful. And zooming out, NATO is a very successful alliance in that regard. I think this explains why Europe would have a defensive alliance like this, but this doesn't really explain why America is in that alliance. America is the most powerful country on Earth. It's got the biggest economy, the most advanced military, and American culture is just the default culture on every continent. It's certainly much stronger than a 12-foot tall arsonist squatter. It'd be over in a day, maybe even 3 hours, but it's not invincible. It does have its own set of limitations. No country, no matter how powerful, can dominate the world alone unless they're going to go around colonizing the whole place. But that's why alliances like NATO, but also very specifically NATO itself, is critical to American hegemony. What is hegemony, you may ask? Hegemony isn't just when a country is strong. A lot of countries are strong. France, China, Britain, Japan, these are strong nations, but they're not hegemons. In order to be a hegemon, you literally need to be the power. It's when your way of life becomes the default. You make the rules that shape the game, and your interests quickly weave themselves into the fabric of global decision-making. It's about control without obvious coercion. It's about making your dominance feel natural, even inevitable. There's that old saying, if you have to tell people you're in charge, you're not in charge. It's when people around the world willingly participate in a system that ultimately benefits you because they've come to see it as the only way things work. The US doesn't have to force countries to use the dollar as the world's reserve currency, it's just the standard. It doesn't have to mandate that English be the language of global business, everyone just learns it. Everything revolves around Americans. When the economy crashed in 2008, Obama had this global meeting on how to avoid a Great Depression, and the first thing the world agreed on was that the US needed to bail out the American middle class in order order to save the global economy. Why did they decide on this over bailing out the EU or empowering China? Because Americans account for over 30% of all global consumer spending despite only being 4% of the global population. This is all very important to know, but how does NATO specifically help further our dominance? And looping around to the beginning, how does it make America stronger and safer? When you're the hegemon, you have to be able to enforce your world order. If you don't enforce it, then you don't really get any of the benefits of hegemony. NATO amplifies American military strength through cooperation, interoperability, and force projection. It's a force multiplier that gives Washington access to far more troops and equipment than it could field itself. Non-US NATO members together have 1.9 million active duty personnel and over 1.2 million reservists, which is bigger than America's 1.3 million active duty personnel and 762,000 reservists. They also add thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft, helicopters, and naval vessels to this arsenal. Like I said, force multiplier. They essentially double our troops and equipment. But also more critically, they provide unique capabilities that strengthen our power. For instance, only 6 countries in the world have nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, and there are only 43 of them in the world. The US has 14 of them, or about 30% share of the world's subs, but when you account for France and the UK, who have 8 combined, the US now has access to 22 of them, and therefore controls the majority of the world's submarines. Being this force multiplier helps soften the load on the United States too. After 9/11, the US invoked Article 5, which is the only time that's been done. Before I get to my point, I would like to point out that the US invoked all of its collective security and mutual defense treaties on 9/11, and not everyone honored that commitment. When we invoked the Rio Treaty, our mutual defense treaty with all of Latin America, Mexico left the alliance rather than go to Afghanistan, and no country on the entire continent or in that entire alliance sent troops or logistical support. On the contrary,
it has now been determined that the attack against the United States of America on the 11th of September was directed from abroad and shall therefore be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack on one or more of the allies in Europe or North America shall be considered as an attack against them all. I want to reiterate yet again today that the United States of America can rely on the full support of its 18 NATO allies in the campaign against international terrorism.
NATO was the first to respond, the first to send resources to the US, the first to back the American war effort. They took over air policing of our airspace in an operation they named Eagle Assist. But then they also came to Afghanistan with us. Finland, Sweden, Albania, Georgia, and Ukraine all went too, long before any of them were NATO members or potential NATO members. In Afghanistan, NATO deployed over 130,000 troops, and this saved the US $50 billion yearly during that 20-year-long war. NATO troops also accounted for 1/3 of all combat deaths. Those weren't their towers and those weren't their people, but thousands of them paid the highest price to avenge them anyways. The majority of the war effort was stationed in Germany, and when American soldiers were wounded, they'd be flown there. During the intervention in Libya, over 60% of the assets used were from NATO members. NATO was responsible for 1/3 of all airstrikes against ISIS, and I know that NATO skeptics dismiss this and say that we could have done all this alone, and I'd say, well, no you couldn't, because the US cannot project power without NATO. There are 28 major US bases in Europe which forward position American forces and enable rapid response to crises in the Middle East and Africa. And let's really dig down here into how important these bases are. Without these bases in Europe, America's ability to project power globally would be severely limited. The reality is that geography still matters. When you're the hegemon, distance is your biggest enemy. The US is on the other side of the planet. The Atlantic and the Pacific aren't just big, they're oceans of time, and in military operations, time is everything. If you have to move a division from the US to a conflict zone, it takes weeks, and you need to load equipment onto ships, deploy airlift, and coordinate logistics and establish supply lines before you can even get started, and that's if nothing goes wrong. But when you already have troops, armor, and aircraft pre-positioned in Europe, you're ready to move right now. These bases cut response times from weeks to hours, and let's be clear, it took the US over a month to organize an army to deploy to Afghanistan, and that was with our European bases, ports, and logistics hubs. Without NATO, it's estimated that the deployment to Afghanistan could have been delayed by at least 6 months. Instead of arriving in October, you're showing up in February and March. Power isn't just about having military strength, it's about being able to use it anywhere at any time. If you can't project force quickly and sustainably, you're not a global power. You're just a regional player with a bloated military budget. And I mean that seriously. The Chinese military has grown substantially, but they lack the ability to respond rapidly around the globe like the US. And it's not just about getting somewhere fast, it's about sustaining a fight once you're there. These bases are full-scale logistics hubs with fuel depots, repair yards, ammunition stockpiles, and the entire support infrastructure needed to keep an operation running indefinitely. Logistics are more important to the United States than any other country on Earth because all the fighting happens over there, and well, we are over here. It's a lot easier to sustain a war effort when you're in your own country rather than traveling 7,000 miles to fight one. And wars aren't won by the first strike, they're won by who can sustain the fight the longest. US bases in Europe ensure that if a conflict drags on, America doesn't run out of options before its enemies do. Beyond logistics, these bases also provide something just as critical: allied integration. The US doesn't fight alone, it fights alongside a NATO force that's fully interoperable, trained together and supported by shared intelligence, airspace access, and coordinated command structures. That's why these bases don't just extend US power, they embed US power into the entire NATO framework. To reiterate here, without NATO, without these European bases, we cannot project power beyond the Western Hemisphere and parts of the Pacific. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the interventions in Syria and Libya, all of them relied on staging out of Europe before forces moved into combat zones and launching airstrikes from these bases. Every major US military operation in the last 30 years has been shaped by America's ability to launch and sustain power from European soil. But I do want to point out here, though, that this isn't just about being able to fight. It's about making sure we don't have to. When the US can project overwhelming force instantly, adversaries think twice. When that force is embedded in a network of allies, they think a third time. NATO skeptics will tell you that ending the alliance doesn't mean ending relations with Europe or that we suddenly become foes. And my response is, have you been on stranded on island for the past month? We are heading towards a hard breakup. I was there for Hegseth's speech. Like, I was in NATO's headquarters for it, and it felt like we had hit an iceberg. And since then, we've redirected our pathway to just make sure we hit every iceberg we possibly can along the way, like a bunch of sickos. There will be no kissing and making up. When you get into things like intelligence, NATO becomes even more vital to the American enterprise. Intelligence is a lot like a puzzle piece. If you only have one puzzle piece, it's kind of hard to determine what you're looking at, and it's essentially pretty worthless. But the more puzzle pieces you get, the more valuable they all individually get. America has great intelligence agencies, but there are always going to be things we can't uncover. So having an alliance like NATO helps us get fuller pictures of situations, and it creates intelligence at scale that multiplies. The US has about 100,000 employees in intelligence agencies. Or at least it did. I don't know how badly the Doge boys have destroyed it yet. But non-US NATO members have around 70,000 intelligence personnel, bringing the total intelligence workforce of the alliance to around 170,000. And that's an enormous advantage in global intelligence collection, especially when you get down into the weeds and start talking about reach, specialization, and redundancy. Different NATO members have access to different regions, cultures, languages, and historical relationships that the US alone simply can't replicate. France has unparalleled intelligence assets in North and West Africa. I mean, truly, their human intelligence network is elite. Germany specializes in signals intelligence and counter-espionage focused on Eastern Europe, and Poland has an intimate understanding of Russian intelligence operations. Each of these nations provides something that the US alone can't replicate, and when you put them together, the collective intelligence network becomes significantly stronger than the sum of its parts. And it's not just that the intelligence ecosystem inside of NATO is just bigger, it's that it's more diverse and resilient. Intelligence operations are always at risk. Sources go dark, networks get compromised, and satellites can only see so much. But when you have multiple intelligence agencies working in parallel, you're never relying on a single source of information. If the US loses access to a certain intelligence stream, there's a good chance the UK, France, or another NATO partner has a way to fill the gap. That kind of layered intelligence infrastructure is what allows the US to maintain decision-making superiority in a crisis. And in a crisis, intelligence is everything. It's what tells you where enemy troops are moving before they arrive. It's what lets you deter threats before they materialize. It's what makes the difference between reacting and controlling the tempo of events. The best example of this you saw with your own eyes: Ukraine. Every day without fail for 4 months, the US was just reading out Putin's daily thoughts and listing off every single thing the Russian military was doing to prepare for an invasion at the end of February. And this gave Ukraine and NATO time to prepare and ensure that military aid flowed in before the first shots were fired. That intelligence intelligence advantage completely changed the war. It forced Russia to fight an armed and ready opponent instead of walking into an easy victory. NATO's intelligence network is one of the most valuable tools the US has to maintain its global dominance, and looking ahead, this intelligence infrastructure is going to matter more than ever. China is pouring resources into cyber warfare, industrial espionage, and military expansion. NATO is increasingly pivoting to that to address that challenge. That means tracking Chinese influence operations, mapping out supply chain vulnerabilities, and countering technology theft, all of which require the kind of intelligence cooperation that only a large interoperable alliance can sustain. And giving a 1,000-mile view here, both the US and China believe themselves to be destined for war. The tech gap is closing between the US and China, if it's not already, which means when it comes down to it, the most primitive metrics here are manpower. Generally speaking, it's hard to beat an opponent that has 4 times as many people as you, and NATO makes up that difference, but we'll get to China later. So I feel I have pretty thoroughly explained how NATO makes the US stronger and safer, so let's talk about how it makes the US more prosperous. We've covered how NATO doubles our forces in nearly every domain and how it allows us to project power, but as we're observing in Ukraine with Russia and North Korea, just because you put one big army next to another doesn't mean that they'll work well together. Interoperability is like putting mayo or pesto or mustard or hummus on a sandwich. You can definitely eat it without the spread, but it's just a bit dry, you know? So the spread definitely helps it all go swimmingly. NATO has standardized everything to ensure that everyone in the alliance can use everyone else's stuff. This ensures that a unit from one country can use another's fuel, ammo, or medical support in the field. This also applies to procurement. For instance, everyone in the alliance uses the same ammunition caliber, NATO 5.56. Every dude who played Call of Duty growing up knows about NATO 5.56. There are over 1,000 of these standardization agreements, and they cover things you wouldn't even think about. For example, military working dogs are trained to the same exact standard across the entire alliance. Some other examples would be pest control, power connectors, how to hide a map in your clothes, how to make smoke signals and how to spot them, and how to talk about the weather with your lads. Now, I do regret to inform you, though, that the NATO standardization process has made it so that British English is the standard within the alliance. No one's going to make you say aluminum like they do, but you will have to spell it that way. But there are some things that aren't standardized in the alliance, such as rations. But I'm about to put y'all on game here. This is something that everyone who opposes NATO doesn't want you to know. This standardization also applies to tech and hardware, and what this means is that everyone's radio can talk to each other, and that everyone's missiles fit into everyone's launchers. So if the plane is Latvian and the missile is Albanian, they work together without issue. But here's the secret: there are no Latvian planes and there are no Albanian missiles. Tech and hardware standardization means that the premier tech partner is the standard setter, and this means that everyone in the alliance is more or less forced to buy American weapons. F-35s, F-16, F-18, C-130, the Apache helicopter, Abrams tanks, Strykers, Bradleys, HIMARS, Patriot missile system, THAAD, Javelins, Stingers, the Aegis combat system, M4, M16. The U.S. sells over 150 unique weapons to NATO countries yearly. 80% of planes, 50% of all ground and artillery vehicles, 40% of the Navy, 70% of the small arms used by NATO are American-made. So what does this mean? It means that NATO is irreplaceable when it comes to our research and development. The F-35 costs over $50 billion in R&D. That's double the F-22 and the Eurofighter development costs, and it's 5 times as much as Russia's Su-57. That's a huge investment, and one that requires an economy of scale in order for it to be worth anything. The US got 15 NATO members to buy the jet, and it's not like they can sell the jet to random countries because it has sensitive hardware in it that our adversaries don't have and don't know about. So having 15 countries who you can trust because you've had an incredibly close relationship with them for over 70 years makes this important. And really, without the alliance, the US doesn't have economies of scale in the defense sector. But pause. What are economies of scale? Basically, it means that the more you produce, the cheaper it gets per unit. So imagine you want to buy a pencil. If you buy just one pencil, the store charges you $1 per pencil. But if you buy a big box of 10 pencils, the price per pencil goes down to 50 cents each. Why? Because making one pencil still requires a factory, workers, and packaging. But when they make 100 pencils at once, those costs get spread out, making each pencil cheaper. Truly, there's no real difference between $1 and 50 cents, but that's still a 50% 50% price reduction. And when you apply that to something like F-35s, we're talking billions of dollars. Right now, the F-35 costs anywhere from $80 to $100 million depending on the model. But if the U.S. wasn't exporting them to NATO, each jet would cost us $486 million. In total, we paid around $400 billion to buy 2,470 F-35s. Without NATO, we'd be paying $1.2 trillion. Then when you factor in sustainment costs and operation costs, we're looking at $2.1 trillion up front. That's prohibitively expensive for even the American military. Not a whole lot of people know this, but for as iconic as they are, there just aren't that many B-2 bombers or F-22 Raptors. There are more blimps in the world than B-2 bombers. The U.S. initially planned to buy 132 B-2 bombers and 750 F-22s, but there are only 21 B-2s and 187 F-22s in existence. Without economies of scale, the cost of them became totally unsustainable and they were canceled. In 2025 dollars, the B-2 was $4 billion per bomber, and the F-22 was over $500 million per jet. Now, NATO critics say that European countries are too dependent on American military tech, and I would say there is some truth to that. However, I would say that's more of a feature than a bug. It's not just that European countries rely on American weapons, it's that American weapons are what they are because of NATO. Without NATO, the defense industry in the U.S. wouldn't have the same level of demand to sustain cutting-edge research and development. And that's the key point critics overlook. The dominance of American military tech isn't just some accident of history. It's a result of decades of NATO-driven cooperation, where interoperability and standardization ensure that American defense contractors have a guaranteed stable market beyond just the Pentagon. Without this, the U.S. would be forced to dramatically scale back R&D spending, meaning fewer breakthroughs, longer development cycles, and fewer units produced. Now let's focus a little bit here on trade. Economic prosperity isn't just about the internal mechanics of an economy, supply, demand, labor markets, or even industrial strength. It's about stability. The foundation of economic growth is predictability. Nothing disrupts economic predictability like war, instability, and unchecked aggression. That's where NATO comes in. The presence of NATO doesn't just deter war, it ensures open, stable economic environment where U.S. businesses can thrive. When European security is guaranteed, it allows American companies to confidently invest, expand, and trade in the most lucrative market on earth, Europe. The European Union and the U.S. are each other's largest trade partners. That's not an accident. Every major expansion of NATO has brought an economic windfall to the United States. Consider the wave of NATO enlargement in the 1990s and 2000s. The newly integrated Central and Eastern European countries saw massive GDP growth after joining NATO because membership meant security, and security means investment, and investment means economic expansion. American businesses capitalized on this, gaining new customers and new supply chains that weren't under the shadow of Russian intimidation. U.S. exports to these new NATO members skyrocketed, multiplying nearly tenfold in under 3 decades. And that effect extends beyond Europe. The U.S. economy isn't built on self-sufficiency, it's built on global reach. American corporations rely on global supply chains, overseas investments, and access to foreign markets. But those markets only exist in a world where economic rules are enforced, where predatory powers can't just dictate trade terms at will. NATO ensures that the global economic order remains one where American businesses set the standard. This is why every credible economic analysis has found that U.S. alliance commitments boost trade and GDP. One study estimated that a 50% cut in U.S. security commitments, meaning an end to NATO as we know it, could lead to a $500 billion drop in trade and GDP. That's not just an economic shift, that's an economic collapse in slow motion. NATO guarantees that the world's most developed markets remain stable, open, and friendly to American businesses. In a world where economic competition isn't just about numbers, but about who gets to shape the rules, NATO ensures that the rules are written by Washington, not Beijing or Moscow. At the core of this prosperity is leverage. NATO gives the U.S. unmatched influence in global economic negotiations. When the U.S. wants sanctions on an adversary, it doesn't just act alone, it has the diplomatic and economic backing of the world's wealthiest and most advanced economies. When Washington pursues trade agreements, NATO allies help the terms, ensuring that American businesses operate in a world built to benefit them. Without NATO, America isn't just economically weaker, it's economically sidelined. The biggest argument against NATO from its critics is that Europe doesn't uphold their end of the bargain. I think there is a tiny bit of truth here, but I think it's mostly an oversimplification. In 2024, 23 of 32 members met or exceeded the guideline of spending at least 2% of their GDP on defense. What does it mean to spend 2% of your GDP on defense? This isn't a payment to NATO or the United States, this is an investment in your own military. So let's say that no one in the alliance met the guidelines for spending except the US. That doesn't mean the US has to pay more for defense, it just means means the alliance is weaker. The countries that border Russia spend the most in the alliance. Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Finland, and Lithuania all spend the most in the alliance, with Poland at almost 5% of their GDP. So who are the 9 not spending 2% of their GDP? Iceland and Luxembourg are on the list. Iceland's strategic position makes it vital to the alliance, and they do allow the US and NATO to base and station whatever they want there. They don't have a standing army, but they also have less people than Wyoming. Luxembourg is more of a case of why not. It's surrounded by the alliance and it's not neutral. Adding them in doesn't hurt. They also contribute in very niche ways. For instance, they help pay for a lot of NATO equipment that the alliance uses. They also invest a lot in satellite and space capabilities too. I think that's a really underrated part of the alliance. Everyone could try to reconstruct the American military to the extent their GDP will let them, but this isn't really the best use of their money. Luxembourg is a wealthy nation, but it doesn't have a ton of people. Should they try to become some small land power? I don't think so. And they don't either. So they focus on space and cyber war and giving funds to other members so that they can buy hardware. Canada is also on this list. There is a case to be made that Canada doesn't need a strong military due to the US taking over its airspace by choice through NORAD and Canada's only neighbor being the United States. However, I would make the argument that while Canada may not have much to bring to the alliance in terms of Europe, I think if they spent 2% and focus on the Arctic, that could be transformative for themselves and for the alliance. Portugal is on this list too, and they have Canada syndrome, I would say. They are so far away from everything that it's hard to justify spending more on defense. You could say, well, we made an agreement, and I would say sure, but we're all democracies. Try getting elected in Portugal saying we need to spend more on the military to combat Russia. Portugal is closer to North America than it is to Moscow. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not making excuses for anyone. I just think it's important that you have context into who's not paying and why, because so often in our politics, Trump just lies and then shadow boxes his own lie. Belgium is on the list. NATO is based there. It's a beautiful country with the nicest people, but my God, its political system is a total disaster. The rest of the list is Spain, Italy, Slovenia, and Croatia, and they all suffer from fiscal rules and debt. So in the US, we have a lot of debt because we keep cutting taxes while raising spending. It's fairy tale budgeting. That is only possible because we have the world's reserve currency. These nations don't have that privilege, so they just can't take on tons of debt, and they face legal limits on deficits. 2008 also totally rocked a lot of them in ways they're still recovering from. Italy and Spain both spend more on interest payments on their existing debt than on defense, and when you have a fiscal situation like that, you naturally let military investment fade, especially when you're as isolated as they are. We could kick them out of the alliance, but as I covered earlier in the video, their bases alone justify their admission. But I would also say, what kind of message does it send that you can only be an American ally during your best of times? Now, I think I will push back here on the 2% metric, because I don't think it fully reflects output or overall contribution to NATO security, and I would argue that it's a bad way of telling if members are pulling their own weight. Simply hitting 2% doesn't guarantee useful capabilities. A country could spend tens of billions on combat boots and clear that threshold without really making the alliance any safer. For example, one member might spend 2% largely on personnel and pensions for a large army that isn't fully modernized, while another at 1.5% could be investing in cutting-edge technology and deployable forces. Even two countries at 2% may have different levels of military capability and readiness. The metric also doesn't account for efficiency, like how well the money is spent. The 2% has taken a gospel-like standing, but it doesn't tell us who's contributing equally to the alliance. And so I think if President Trump wanted to be constructive and not just destroy all American alliances for no particular reason, he could introduce new metrics, because I do think the world is dangerous right now, and we'd benefit from pushing our friends to be more effective. Some new metrics would be the percentage of defense spending devoted to equipment, or an index of deployable assets and sustainability of forces in the field. Another way I think the 2% metric is flawed, and it kind of ties back to my first point, is that the US is on the other side of the world, so its defense spending is all about getting to the fight. In Europe, that's where the fight will be. So Poland building new hardened shelters may count towards this year's 2% goal, but you'd have to hit it every year. So Poland building new hardened shelters may count towards this year's 2% goal, but you have to hit it every single year. So Poland building something that will last for years only counts once, because it's not like you need to re-harden something every year. Additionally, dual-use infrastructure isn't counted in this metric. Improving railways and highways is good for the people of the country, but when war hits, they'll be critical. And simply put, Host nations also incur direct costs, both environmental and social, for basing foreign troops that aren't priced into the budget. All of this means the 2% number, on its face, doesn't fully capture the extent to which a country supports the alliance through land, facilities, or integration. For example, a nation like Italy or Turkey, which hosts multiple NATO and US bases, provides enormous strategic value to NATO operations that isn't reducible to how many euros a government spends on defense in a year. Like, how much is your entire population having military training worth? How much is a choke point like the Bosphorus Strait or the Strait of Gibraltar worth? Some allies punch above their weight in NATO missions despite modest budgets. Conversely, some big spenders contribute less to certain operations. The 2% metric ignores this discrepancy. During NATO's mission in Afghanistan, or in the training missions in Iraq, for instance, Denmark deployed a high number of troops relative to their populations. Allies also contribute via specialized capabilities. Estonia and Latvia invest heavily in cyber defense and secure communications, which bolster NATO's collective security but costs relatively little. Additionally, financial spending alone doesn't count things like a country's sacrifice in blood or risk acceptance. Simply put, the 2% metric does not adequately capture all the different ways that allies are spending their resources on capabilities and programs that improve the Transatlantic Alliance. So, do I think Americans are justified in their criticism over European defense spending? I think it's fair in the sense that NATO is a collective endeavor, and all members did agree to reach the 2% guideline. However, the criticism is oversimplified and it ignores the nuances above, like that global spending isn't directly comparable and that allies contribute in non-monetary ways. For example, it's worth noting that if NATO Europe were a single country, its defense spending would be second only to the United States, which far exceeds that of any potential adversary. The issue is often less about total spending than how it's coordinated and what capabilities are built. This is why I think that the tone of US criticism should shift from this oversimplified 2% number and focus instead on capability targets and better integration. So what if we left NATO? Let's kind of explore this. I have a feeling President Trump and Musk will try this, so let's map it out. Off the bat, defense spending would not decrease. Only about 10% of U.S. defense spending is devoted to the European theater. That means 90% is focused on the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific, in addition to cyber and nuclear. So leaving NATO would not automatically shrink the defense budget in a major way. The U.S. is a global power with far-reaching commitments, so any funds freed from Europe would just be reallocated to other military needs. We would still need to maintain forces to deter adversaries like China and Iran, protect global trade routes, and counter terrorism. We'd still need a large military to protect our interests worldwide, NATO or not. Maybe you save a tiny bit of money, but you would be blowing up your ability to project power in any meaningful way beyond the Pacific, and you'd be blowing up your relationship beyond repair with 31 allies. The strategic implications of leaving NATO are pretty dire. We would have to completely rethink how to secure our interests abroad. I know that the Trump administration envisions a world where NATO doesn't exist, but we maintain security agreements with Poland and the UK, and that's pretty pants-on-head dumb. It also completely ignores that we aren't leaving NATO because we have to due to some unfortunate circumstances. We're leaving because Trump likes Russia, and so we're leaving by giving everyone the middle finger during their time of need. I just don't see a situation where we leave and Europe doesn't become an adversary. And so with that, the US will have to spend more time to defend itself, not just from Russia and China, but also Europe. While a NATO exit might allow for reductions in heavy ground forces, it will necessitate higher spending on air and naval power to both guard the Atlantic and reinforce allies in other regions. The US will have to expand the Atlantic fleet and anti-submarine warfare investments to ensure Russia cannot threaten North America or shipping lanes if the U.S. Navy is no longer operating with its European friends. In the Pacific, Washington will need to accelerate procurement of advanced fighters, bombers, and missiles to deter China. It's quite an expensive proposition. Even nuclear forces will see added emphasis. Without NATO's collective deterrence, the U.S. might feel pressure to modernize its nuclear arsenal, further to unilaterally deter Russia and others. America's global influence would almost certainly diminish, especially in Europe. For 75 years, NATO has been a primary vehicle of U.S. leadership. It has given Washington a decisive voice in European security and, by extension, European politics. Through NATO, the U.S. effectively became a European power with a unique voice in European affairs well beyond defense. And if that link is severed, the United States would lose a significant degree of leverage over its richest trading partners. European nations would pursue more independent or even contrary policies, no longer feeling bound by U.S. leadership. For instance, on issues like confronting China or Iran, a NATO-less Europe would be less aligned with U.S. strategies, since the glue of the alliance. In fact, experts warn that an abrupt U.S. pullback would create a rift where European nations are much more likely to follow China despite the U.S. I will also go out on a limb here and say the United States will absolutely hate it when Europe takes care of its own defense. European governments will hedge their bets. They might seek a more neutral stance between Washington and Beijing, or accommodate Russian interests to avoid a conflict. This weakening of Western unity is precisely what rivals like Moscow and Beijing desire. Russia's strategic goal has long been to push the U.S. out of Europe, and a U.S. NATO exit would hand the Kremlin a huge victory. The Kremlin would feel emboldened to exert greater influence over Eastern Europe. If NATO's U.S.-led security guarantee evaporated, likewise, China would benefit from any transatlantic split. A divided West makes it easier for Beijing to expand its economic and political footprint in Europe without U.S. interference. Overall, America's ability to shape global norms and coalitions, from sanctions regimes to human rights initiatives, would be undermined if allies perceive Washington as no longer reliable. I have seen some MAGA people say that we'll just sanction Europe, and I think this comes from ignorance. The U.S. sanctioning Europe would just be the end of American domination of financial markets and the end of the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. As it stands, the U.S. and Europe combined are 46% of the global economy. When you add in Canada, South Korea, Japan, and Australia, we very quickly get over that 55% mark. Our allies going along with them and not objecting to them is what allows us to impose sanctions and make them effective. Once this Transatlantic Alliance is split, and if you assume our allies in the Pacific don't split either, China and the EU overtake the US and control the global economy, and the sanctions regime can no longer be. Our defense innovation will crumble because without markets for exports, we won't be able to fund the research we need. And it doesn't help either that Doge is just destroying every research lab in the country. The fact of the matter is that NATO is cheaper than fighting alone. In fact, a 1997 congressional study on NATO's post-Cold War future concluded that not expanding or supporting NATO would incur greater costs and risk to European stability, whereas alliance commitments ultimately save money by preventing conflict. Now, NATO critics will point to the 1970s, when Nixon withdrew troops from South Korea in an effort to cut costs, and they point out that it did not trigger disaster. And that's true. But President Nixon gave diplomatic assurances, reaffirmed the Mutual Defense Clause, and sent a lot of military aid to South Korea. Trump, on the other hand, has said that he'll let Russia do whatever the hell it wants to Europe. He's trying to force Ukraine to surrender, and he's continually said he won't uphold Article 5. If the U.S. withdraws, it's over. Leaving NATO would be catastrophic for the United States. You will be poor. You will be less safe, and the era of American dominance will be over. Make no mistake, without NATO, the U.S. would still be powerful, but it would be isolated. It would be another great power among many, instead of the gravitational force that holds the global order together. NATO isn't just a military alliance, it's the backbone of American global dominance. And that's exactly why those who want to see an end to American leadership, Russia, China, and every autocratic regime that hates a world where democracy and free markets reign are desperate to see NATO fall apart, because they know that without NATO, America's grip on global leadership would weaken. And when America steps back, it's not a vacuum that forms, it's a power shift, and the beneficiaries are not our friends. NATO isn't a charity, it's not a burden, it's the greatest return on investment in American history. It multiplies our power, secures our economy, and cements our position as the leader of the free world. The moment America abandons NATO is the moment America stops being the global hegemon. And when that happens, the world doesn't get more peaceful, it gets more dangerous. For everyone. But especially for us. Now, before I let you go, I want to push back on this claim that the Vice President has made before. He will tell you that Europeans hate America and Americans. And I'm here to tell you, after 4 years of traveling back and forth across the Atlantic, that's just not true. Now, do some Europeans have issues with our leadership, past and present? Sure. But that's not the same as resenting the American people, because here's what actually happens. No matter where I'm at, someone will hear my accent and ask what state I'm from, and then without fail, they'll share a story about a summer in New York, a road trip down the Pacific coast, their honeymoon in Las Vegas, their semester in Chicago, a friend or a sibling who moved to Boston or Austin or Miami and never looked back. And that's not just them, that's us too, because that's what people do when they feel connected. They share stories, they find common ground, they recognize something of themselves and one another. Now, I get it, if you spend too much time online, you might start believing that all you hear from across the Atlantic are cheap shots and snide remarks. But I'll tell you this, never, not once, have I heard a European say anything like that to my face. And if a joke on the internet about America's problems is enough to push you over the edge, then maybe it's time to step outside, because these folks, they're an ocean away. And let's not forget, we joke about them too. So if you're going to dish it out, you have to be willing to take it. But let's not lose sight of what actually matters here, because the relationship between America and Europe has never been about one president, one administration, or one viral moment. It is deeper than that. It is stronger than that. It has been built brick by generations who understood that our prosperity, our security, our freedom, they are bound together. That when we stand united, the world is safer. And when we turn on each other, the world is weaker, because history is not something that happens to us. It is something we shape. It is something we write through our choices, our values, our willingness to rise to the moment. And right now, this is that moment. A moment that demands clarity. A moment that demands leadership. A moment that demands that we remember who we are. We are the inheritors of a world order built not on conquest, but on cooperation. Built not on dominance, but on democracy. And if we allow cynicism, complacency, or petty grievances to drive a wedge between us, then we will have no one to blame but ourselves. Because our stories may be singular, but our destination is shared, and the future is ours to write together. And so the question before us is not whether this alliance will endure. It has endured wars and crises. It has endured the rise and fall of governments. It has endured because it was built on something greater than any one nation's interests alone. The question before us is whether we will be the stewards of that inheritance, whether we will uphold the work of those who came before us, who built a better world not with cynicism, not with division, but with determination, faith, and hope. Because that is our charge. That is our responsibility. That is the work of our time. And if we do that work, if we stand together, if we reject the voices that tell us we're too divided, too different, too broken to forge a broken future, then I believe in my heart that history will once again be on our side. Because history does not bend towards justice or peace or progress on its own. It bends because people like us in moments like these choose to reach for something better. And I still believe we can. I still believe we will, because that is who we are. And that is the story we must write together. Like, comment, subscribe, share. Thank you for watching.